Okay, we might have some folks who weren't here last week, so I always like to do a review. And the first review is actually for the online people. You probably noticed you don't have to be admitted, so that's good. So if somebody joins late, I don't miss them. I'm not exactly joking, but I'm sort of joking about if you have tech questions, just email me later, because I really can't help you much. I probably can't help you even later. Mute your microphone, but please feel free to unmute and ask questions anytime. It won't hurt my feelings at all to jump in. And if you want to, you can minimize the little box that has me in it. And we are recording these, and it is available on our YouTube channel now. So if you go to it, and I think they even cleaned it up a little bit, edited it. Okay, so here's the brief review. Last week I asked, what comes to mind when I say forest, and people threw out the usual stuff, a bunch of trees, maybe the environment, saving the world, whatever. But I noted that 500 years ago, it would have been something more like this. People thought of fairies, they thought of robbers, they thought of mystery and magic, black magic, etc. And of course, nowadays, we think more in terms of images like this. So then I brought up Charles Taylor's book, A Secular Age, in which he asked this question, which it's really almost awkwardly worded because it ends up being a kind of double negative. But the basic idea is, why was it easy 1,500 years ago, impossible not to, 500 years ago, to not believe in God? And why is it so hard now? But the bigger question he's really asking is this: how did we go from an enchanted world, so that's what he would call that world where they thought of forests like that, to a disenchanted world where we would say, well, the cost of lumber has really gone up. How did that happen? And that's what we were starting to wrestle with. So just a couple of examples that I used last week. 500 years ago, worshipers snuck the host, that's the name for the bread and communion, out from mass to cure sick cows and help grow their crops. You could try that if you want. We do have a lot of bread in the tray. You could take some home, see if it worked. They thought of priests possessing a kind of white magic in contrast to that in the forests. But 500 years later, and ever since, the Reformation made everything sacred. That was the whole notion, was that why should priests have access and not everybody else? But the problem was, if everything could be sacred, it could also be secular. And then cathedrals, once full of worshipers, have been transformed into all kinds of things: lofts, boutique restaurants, etc. So then, just briefly, we noted his language of enchanted and disenchanted. So an enchanted one, belief in God remains an inevitable option, probably the default option. So the water we swim in is religious. But the disenchanted doesn't mean that doesn't exist. It's just one option among a bunch of others, and probably even seen as a little bit of an outdated category. So it'd be easier to believe in aliens than in demons, at least for some people. Two words we didn't use. And I got to clarify because it's a little bit tricky at times. So the words that Taylor uses are transcendence and immanence. The first line here is not from Taylor. Generally speaking, theologians will say, well, God is both transcendent and immanent. God is this high, lofty, lifted up being and came near in the flesh in the incarnation of Jesus. So they'll use it both to be characteristics of God. What Taylor does is use it in a different way. Transcendence would be this awareness of enchantment. But immanence would be locked in to what's around us. What you see, that's all there is. Yeah, this cathedral, it's got a big tall ceiling, but don't let it fool you. It's just a lot of trouble to heat it and cool it. But there's nothing magical happening here. There's no divine presence. So for Taylor, a disenchanted worldview is people who are locked into this immanent frame, as he calls it. And then we just briefly mentioned that the phrase he really likes is cross-pressured. We feel some kind of echo of Eden, even though we kind of doubt it. So cathedrals empty of worshipers, people still want to get married there. Spirituality, notice I added golf, right? Kale, prayer, yoga, Bible, golf. You pick, right? You know, whatever. What are you into? We've got it. We'll offer it for you. And then famously, this is what Taylor's really kind of known for as a little saying is, we long for what we doubt. We don't believe in the mystery, the magic, the enchantment, the transcendence anymore, but boy, do we have a longing in us. That's his thesis. And then another thing that he said, and again, this is just a little bit of review, secular too would be the way most people in culture use the word secular. And they would mean, what Taylor means by that is not religious. So it's not religious. So people will gripe about what secular II society has done. It's taken away this, it's taken away that. Taylor says, that's not what I'm interested in. He's interested in secular III, which again means we're locked in immanence. Don't worry about transcendence. God's an option, but you know, there's other things to do. So he says what we did as a culture is we just added things on. So to a world that had magical things, are there people that still think that way? Absolutely. Well, but we added an informed mind. And so some people would be able to hang on to both of those, and others would go, I got an informed mind. I'm not going to believe in that stuff. Same thing for the next one. To communal living, although I have to say that one's rarer because in the West we're very individualistic. We added this notion of the private individual. And then last, to the cosmos, this ordered world created by God, well, we added the universe. So can't even, you know, the Earth's not at the center, everything's been shaken up. Okay, so that's what we did, and that was bearings, where are we, how do we get there? Today we're doing topography. What's the lay of the land? What is it like to live here? And then next week, the compass. So here's just an opening question, or questions. What have been your reflections since last week's presentation? What sticks with you a week later? What maybe bugs you? What have you been chewing on? What does this review bring up for you? Anybody? I mean, you don't have to, but I'm just curious to know.
Two things. One was reading silently, really like that, and the idea that nobody is raised in the church, but they sure want to come back and get married in church. I love those things. Those are really good.
So say more about the silent reading. What intrigued you about that?
The whole idea, you know, it's kind of like the curtain that was ripped and everything. It's open to everybody now. It's, gee, I don't need you. I got the Bible, or I got whatever it is. I make my own interpretation of what that is. So.
Yeah, the historians that look at that, they, you know, like if you're a product of our culture, some people go, I don't get it. How could there have not been silent reading? Well, it's because they thought of reading the way we think of a CD. Like if I brought in a CD and said, hey, I got a new CD, what do you think? That's not what you do with a CD. You play a CD. And so they thought of texts on paper or papyrus or whatever was on as something you put in the player. So you read it out loud. That's the way you read. And for them to eventually come to this place where, you know, you could just read and not even move your lips, not even make a sound. This was mind-boggling. So it's what's interesting to me about it is not just the particulars of it, but that the culture, you know, I get it, it's 500 years, but we're talking about a drastic shift. Yeah, Steve.
But mine is, in that shift, was the line flat for 400 of the years, and then it started going up, or were there incremental, so it, that 100 years later, people are saying, oh my gosh, we've lost what we once had, and then 100 years later, oh, we've lost it.
Yeah, well, there are periods, no question. There are markers that people will say, like, you know, the Enlightenment, obviously, and the Renaissance, the printing presses, ability to spread things. There are markers like that. Some people in more recent times will talk about the 60s, that these are, you know, it's just a very turbulent time where think Laugh-In, think Watergate, think Vietnam, think burning bras, think, you know, question all authority. That, you know, this is a big shift too. So yeah, there'd be these marker moments that just sort of add up. Yeah, no question. All right.
I guess I just keep thinking of how much loss of power it was for the clergy in the Catholic world when other people could read, because I think they held that all they had to do was say, this is what God wants. I know, I'm telling you, and therefore this is what God wants. And you would either go to eternal damnation or be saved just based on what that powerful person said.
There are clergy who still lament the loss of power. In my classes, I taught an elective in which I said, if you were to have a sermon that was open for discussion and you should have seen them, they're like, no, that's mine. That belongs to me. They didn't want to be questioned.
I was going to say the exact same thing. There are a lot of preachers who still say, you can read the Bible, but you can't interpret it. I'm the only one who can. I interpret God.
Yeah.
Which is contrary to all of what Martin Luther said and the whole, they're not being Protestant when they
Right.
say that, but they.
Right.
But on the other side of that is people without any background knowledge who just pick up the Bible, any translation of it, and try to interpret it just using today's meanings from words.
Mhm.
And that's, I mean, I think one of the neat things about being disciple is that we don't have a set of proscribed beliefs,
Right.
but then you have to do the work to figure out what your belief is.
What's it?
At the other end of the spectrum is the people who have spent their life studying the Bible and disagree with each other.
Yeah, it's true. It's true.
What's the quote about if the center is everywhere, then the center is nowhere? And that's kind of what this is all about.
Right. Right.
So,
Yeah.
the relative authority.
Yeah, it kind of aligns pretty nicely with what is called postmodernism, but postmodernism is very misunderstood. So some people say postmodernism means there's no such thing as a meta-narrative anymore. There are no hard and fast rules. And then the critics go, you mean like the one you just gave us? That there's no hard and fast rule? More accurate philosophers say postmodernism would be, well, like Taylor describes. Hey, maybe there is such a thing as ultimate truth, but who's got it? Who's got access to it? You have an MDiv from seminary, so you have access to it? Are you kidding? So there's a kind of questioning. They might say there is an ultimate truth, but who could even have access to it? And others would go, well, you couldn't even know if there is an ultimate truth. So you hear the kind of slipperiness of that. Okay, well, we've got a lot to do here. All right, so here's what I'm really trying to get at, besides just what's the lay of the land, what's it like? What difference does it make if our existence has become disenchanted? So what? I mean, it's just the way it is, so it doesn't matter. So I mentioned this just briefly last week. I think of it as a continuum. On one end would be the new atheists. So those are the militant ones that write the books that try to kill off God and convince everybody to give it up. And they refuse to see any enchantment. They would refuse to even admit there might be a God. On the other end would be religious fundamentalists who are pretending that everything is enchanted. It's all enchanted to the point that they're willing to explain away evil. So instead of saying, well, we do live in an enchanted world, but we live in east of Eden, there's thorns in the garden, whatever, they need to defend the enchantment. And so the way they do that is they'll even say, well, God wanted to take your baby home, whatever it is. Most of us live somewhere in the middle. Yeah.
Do you think that in order to believe in God, you have to believe in enchantment?
So the question, because I'm supposed to be repeating it for the OWL people that are online, do you think that you have to believe in God to believe in enchantment? Is that what you? Oh, the other way around. Do you have to believe in enchantment to believe in God? I don't know.
I mean, I don't think so personally, but
Okay. What's your definition of enchantment?
well, it's kind of what I said last week, some kind of magical God. I mean,
Yeah,
for me, God is all of us doing the work of the Lord that we're supposed to be doing. It's not,
yeah, I think Taylor's definition isn't that narrow. Taylor's definition would be, can you appreciate beauty in the world? That's enchantment. Can the group that works together to feed the poor, can that be an example of enchantment? Is that a kind of enchantment too? That we're doing the work of God is an enchantment view. Okay, so still the question of what difference does it make? Well, I already told you that we were going to look at this one part. That's really twofold, I think. Ruth says it's what technology is doing to us and the resulting pace of life. So you can even see the subtitle, maybe, at the top. I put it down there as well. Keeping sacred time against the speed of modern life. When I first started into this book, and this is volume 3, and I'd read the other 2 volumes, and I thought, okay, wait a second. You've taken Charles Taylor's monster book, and you've said, what does this mean for church life? And your focus is going to be on technology and the speed of life. And I thought, well, okay, I get that. That is definitely a part of the secular age, but it just didn't seem enough to me. And of course, as anybody will tell you, when you review a book, the one thing reviewers are not supposed to do is to say, well, you didn't do this. Well, you can't critique what they didn't do. You got to critique what they did do. So, mea culpa. But before we consider that, I'm just wondering, what do you think, besides technology and the pace of life, is there any kind of consequence of living in a disenchanted age for you? I came up with a few, but. Okay, well, I'll jump in. Yeah, go ahead.
Well, there might be some lack of purpose in terms of, for me, it's nice to think that believing in God, that there is a purpose, and a purpose for me. I was put here for a purpose. And you take that away, and it's all about just what's going on day to day in this humdrum world that we live in.
Yeah,
And where's the purpose in that?
yeah, Scott.
I feel like people care more about like what's on TV than actually like living life. I've accepted that a couple times.
Yeah, so if you didn't hear that, he said, some people care about more what's going on TV than what's going on in real life. Okay, so here's how I want to get to it. I mentioned this before in the Life Worth Living class. The word virtue, it's a Latin word, but it's linked to the Greek term arete, or excellence. So the virtue of a knife, that's what knives are supposed to do. They cut well. If it doesn't, it's not a virtuous knife. But what's the virtue of persons? What are they supposed to do? So this gets to what you were just saying. So a flourishing life is a term we used last week. Find ultimate meaning, purpose, a reason to live bigger than themselves. And that's really what Scott's saying too. It's bigger than TV. There's got to be more to it. So here's a couple of questions that I think are always worth asking. What is it about our disenchanted age that hinders flourishing? Is there something that it may be harmless in itself, but it does hinder flourishing? And then what aids flourishing? So here's my list. The first one is you can become desensitized to transcendence. You can start to just take it for granted. So, a few years back, the word BlackBerry evoked the images of the device, not the fruit, which is really a shame. But I'm thinking here, maybe some of you know that Elizabeth Barrett Browning's line in her epic poem, Aurora Leigh. So it goes like this: Earth's crammed with heaven, and every common bush is afire with God. But only those who see take off their shoes, the rest sit round it and pluck blackberries. Which is just a great line of, is it possible, using the Moses narrative in Exodus 3, is it possible that every bush is on fire, but maybe we just don't turn aside to look? Because it's when Moses turns aside to look that God has the encounter with him. And looking is a really key thing in that text. So, you know, it seems to me one of the things you could lose is you could start to have this flat world in which you no longer see the kind of mystery of it. The little moments, which, by the way, I think it was my wife who noticed it. She rode along with me on our golf course where I play. And on the 15th hole at the tee box, right next to it were wild blackberries. And for a few weeks, I was having blackberries on the 15th tee, and I was grateful to God for those. Do y'all know the story of Truman taking a walk every day with his Presbyterian minister friend? And at this address, still there, I assume, 611 West Maple, Harry Truman would leave his minister friend, go over to the ginkgo tree, give it a little pat, and say, "You're doing a good job." Those people have that tree. I mean, it's a nice little thing, you know. I have that kind of worldview. I mean, I just do. So, and then another thing, just kind of related to this desensitizing, the difference between chronos and kairos. You may have heard this before. It's the two Greek words for time. So the former one, we know that one's the ticking of the clock. So Paul says to the Galatians, in the fullness of time, Christ was born. And in a moment on the calendar, at the right moment, this is when Christ came. When Mark starts his gospel, he has this phrase, when the time is fulfilled, the time is right. And he's not talking about on your watch, on the calendar. He's using kairos. And so what, you know, one way of thinking of it is this little line I put here, epiphanies, those kind of moments where you see the blackberries or you have a religious experience, whatever, are kairos moments that happen in the midst of chronos. So for me, one of the losses of a disenchanted world is unable to appreciate some of the transcendence that's around us. A second one, substituting artificial forms of Christianity. And the one that Root puts forward is moralistic therapeutic deism. That would be on the test in seminary. So, moralistic. Religion calls us to be good, not a jerk. Well, now that's a great start. I mean, right? We all had enough of jerks. But if that's the definition of religion, you know, moralistic, well, then there's nothing really said about systemic injustices like racism and hunger, and the list goes on. So they've boiled down religion to just be good. Therapeutic, well, this religion should help me feel good. So I'm supposed to be good, and it's about me feeling good. And so he talks about a consumption that's not keeping up with the Joneses, it's going beyond the Joneses. And I could tell you about the homes that are being built on the golf course where I am. One of them is 8,500 square foot. It's pretty big. How about this one, though? This is the story that I just heard. So one of my former students, she got her PhD in New Testament. She teaches at a religious college, and she recently went on Facebook to answer a survey that a pastor I know had put on there about how are you handling COVID, and what will church life be like for you after COVID when it's totally over? And she said, we're not going back. Now, this is a person with a PhD in New Testament who teaches at a religious college and who is active, or was, in her church, the whole family. She said, you know, going to the beach is just a lot better. It's just better. I mean, we were running ourselves ragged and doing all these things, so we're not going back. So a lot of people who are reflecting on church life post-COVID are hearing stories like that, and they're wondering, well, what does this mean? And then the last one is the deism, where there's a notion of God, but it's more of a decorative concept. There is a God that exists that makes no demands in our day-to-day lives. So Root says that this MTD is a kind of substitute Christianity that has crept in a kind of secular age, disenchanted age. I also thought about Neil Postman because I've always been impressed with this book, The Demise of Critical Thinking and Reflection. So I love this. Postman points to one of the 7 Lincoln Douglas debates. He See the date there. Douglas started with a 3-hour address. Then Lincoln, who was supposed to talk, knew that he would go that long, so he proposed a dinner break. The people came back, and he delivered a 3-hour rebuttal. And if you look at the script of this, there are sentences that a lot of people nowadays, high school, wouldn't even be able to understand. Postman calls this a typographic way of thinking. They could intellectually process the argument. In fact, Lincoln, more than once during his rebuttal, the people started applauding, and he said, "Oh, please don't applaud. I do not want your emotions. I want your intellect. I want you to think about the concepts that I'm saying here." And this was not a race for president or even Senate. Postman calls it the age of show business, and he notes, like, there's a great piece there about one of the early ads, Paul Revere, who made false teeth, and it was in the Boston Gazette. And it's this paragraph of exposition of why his materials and craftsmanship are superior. And that's all it was. It was just words. It was just logical thought. As opposed to the way advertising now is built very much on image and even counterintuitive, counter rationality. And so, I don't know, I'm just, thinking that one of the things that we're suffering from is perhaps a lack of critical thinking. I don't know if you can totally tie that into the disenchanted world or not, because at the same time, there are people who are deep thinkers who are, kind of denying enchantment. So,
Well, and in the enchantment world, people weren't allowed in religion to have critical thinking.
right. So it's probably another example of the complications of a culture that has shifted over time. Okay, so I'm just kind of curious what your response is to those three, and then we're going to dive into the pace of life and technology. Any thoughts on any of those? Okay. So both Taylor and Rosa, they responded to Taylor's work on a secular age, and both of them, and really what Ruth's doing is responding to Rosa here on the technology and the speed of life that is undoing it. So just a few examples. This is pretty mind-boggling. Before 1830, the average speed of travel by ship was 10 miles an hour. By 1920, by steamship and train, 50. By 55, 350. And by 1965, 600 miles per hour. But I love this. In the late 19th century, there were warnings against bicycle face, that the exertion against the wind and leaning into the handlebars could lead to a person being unusually flushed. I don't think bicycle face was a permanent condition. You would just suffer from it when you got to where you were going. And then with the advent of the railroad, there's all kinds of stuff you can find online about the so-called experts warning of brain damage, digestive problems. Humans weren't meant to go that fast, they argued. A lot of the poets argued that. And some people would say maybe the body's not meant to go 600 miles per hour. Okay, so Rosa contends that life has sped up. I'd be curious to know if you believe that. But going faster, we didn't get through earlier, we just went further. And whereas before we could only answer 5 letters a day or whatever it was, we could now respond to emails faster, but more of them. We could do 55 emails in a day. We could even get into a little bragging contest. Who has answered the most emails today? On the other hand, some things that are speedy are good, like an ambulance when you've had a stroke. So the speed thing is a kind of mixed bag. So what they're not doing is bashing technology. They're not Luddites basking technology. And I love this list because the moment we think technology, we only think about what's right here in front of us in the room, as opposed to scissors, staplers, electric lights, and this thing over PowerPoint over Zoom. And then they show how not everything does speed up. Traffic on highways. Although I have to say that during COVID, people drive faster than they used to. Don't know why that is. But the gestation of babies. This is how long gestation is. You know, the 40 weeks is the 40 weeks. And this is just the way it is. So what is a legitimate claim or critique of our fast-paced culture, and what do we mean by life speeding up? So Postman in his book Technopoly, which he says he's not a Luddite, but he comes kind of close. I'm just being honest with you. He says there are three types of cultures in relation to tech. There were first tool using. So somebody thought, you know, if we invented a plow or if we invented a bucket, this would be great. If we invented stirrups. The one about stirrups, though, was really interesting. So before that time, you know, people are kind of jostling all around, right, on the horse. In war, the way you used a horse was you rode it to the battle and you got off to fight. Stirrups, for the first time, allowed people to fight on horses. So technology is a kind of mixed bag. That's the tool using. Later cultures, he calls technocracies. So these things, threaten might be a strong word, but that would be the kind Postman likes to use. This threatens to shape the culture. Culture's not using them, it could shape them. So we know the printing press is input or impact, but the telescope, what's the telescope's impact? Threatens the church, because the church says, well, the earth's at the center of this world and everything revolves around it. And people get some telescopes and they go, well, it's not the way it works. So he says in a tool using and a technocracy, things just kind of battle back and forth. But he says we've entered into a technopoly in which the tie between information and purpose gets severed. And the invention of invention becomes the new thing. Startups. So, and I love this line, our problems, and you could add to the list, nuclear war, starvation, families broken up, whatever, they don't happen as a result of lack of information. We're overwhelmed with information, but that hasn't fixed these big things. So what's a legitimate claim, critique? What do we might mean by life speeding up? What are the consequences? I'm going to pause there for a second. Yep.
Well, on the second, life speeding up, I can just go from when I first started practicing law to when I stopped practicing law. At first, you know, if something was really important, you could send a document out by Federal Express. And that was even, you know, before that, it was 3 days, you know, 3 days there, 3 days back. You had all this time to put in your comments and figure it out. But it also made things harder to do and you couldn't get as many transactions done. By the time I left, you know, we weren't sending things by Federal Express. It was, we're sending documents by email or whatever. And we were doing them on a computer as opposed to having to have a secretary do them on.
Right.
And there were good things and bad things. I mean, one thing was you couldn't say it'll be in the mail tonight. I have it done, I'll mail it tonight, you know, unless you really had it done, because they'd say, well, why don't you? But the good thing was that you didn't spend as much time doing it. And, but, you know, it was just like you were saying, it's a balance, but it wasn't the thing that was bad, it's how you use it.
Well, and that's the critique is they said you could get more done. So, and this is why all those people predicted that we would have these short work days, because you'd get more done, you'd be done. But what we did instead is we said, well, if you can get more done, then let's get more done. Let's get even more done. By the way, a friend of mine went to work for the post office and he was a deliverer and he got back by like 11 o'clock in the morning. And they said, what are you doing here? I'm done. They said, well, they need to take over this route too. Right. So he learned very quickly, oh, well, then maybe it'll take me longer tomorrow. You know? I might not be done till 3 tomorrow. Yeah, Steve.
Maybe the simple idea that maybe this shift really began to mirror the movement from an agrarian society to an industrialized society. Because in the agrarian world, you're ruled by the seasons.
Right.
And how long does it take to grow a crop of corn? Well, during that time, you're waiting for it to grow. You're doing other things.
Yeah.
But really, it's a build up to when the crop.
Plus it gets dark at night.
Yeah. Can't do anything.
Right.
When Nancy and I lived in Washington DC, one of the things we noticed was the pace of life was definitely quicker. Physically, people lived further apart, and so they tended to, get up earlier, and then they're rushing to get to the office, and then they're rushing to get home to pick up their kids, and so it's kind of rush. And then everybody was in a hurry professionally. They were trying to get ahead. And so there was this hurry professionally that took place. And when we finally had a chance to figure out where we wanted to live after Nancy graduated from law school, we said, we think we want to get back to the Midwest where the pace is not so quick.
Yeah.
And that was a conscious decision on our part.
Yeah.
Where people like each other.
Yeah. Okay, so here's the list of consequences. First one is we cannot process all the incoming global information. We just can't do it. And I think because of that, we could become uncaring about others around the world. It's a really interesting thing. So ever since telegraph and more recently with the internet, we know more. So what am I going to do about the crises in Afghanistan or Haiti? Or this morning I saw on CNBC the election results in Germany. Big thing. I don't know what to do with that. I just don't know what to do with that. Now, if someone says to me there's a rise of a neo-Nazi party, well, if we'd have known something more than we knew in the 30s. So, but I can't keep up with it. Most of us can't.
But even then, you knew people were saying things then and sending communications back, and they just weren't being believed.
Right.
And so it's sort of the same thing now.
Yeah. Did I hear somebody online?
I think that's me.
Oh, okay.
I find myself almost consciously saying, I'm going to follow this one. I'm not going to follow it. I'm going to care about this one. The other one, I don't have enough for all of this coming in. I can't carry all of this. I can carry some.
Yeah.
Plus, so much of it is now conflicted.
Sure. Yeah. I'm going to talk about that one in just a
Once
second.
upon a time, there were only 3 channels.
Right. And you can trust
You
Walt.
trust the news because that's the only one that's on.
Yeah.
Two, if you lived in Jefferson City.
Okay, so here's the other one that Al just mentioned. Unfiltered information in social media can lead to a fractured society. Now, here's what I really thought was interesting. Unlike the courts, so he uses this example. So you're arguing a case and you want to say X, Y, and Z. Well, it has to be relevant. The judge can rule that is irrelevant. You cannot make this statement. So the rules of a court, yes, things can go wrong there, but there's somebody making the rule that it has to be relevant. There's nobody making the rule now. Anything can be posted, and they've pretty much shown that misinformation spreads like wildfire. It just goes around the world just like that. So because of this, the pace of life and the speed of technology, misinformation and division, and when I'm asked, what's the hope for healing that? I don't have much hope for healing that. I don't see how you put the genie back in the bottle once. If my source of news contradicts this source of news on science, we're done as far as I'm concerned. But I don't know. Also, the pace can just run us ragged even to illness. Lots of studies done about that. And it's so odd that humans in need of rest tend to speed up. We also do that when we're lost. When we're lost, instead of saying, okay, stop and figure out what's going on, we go fast. And then Sabbath rest renews some others, but others are in desperate need of a break. And I've always found this interesting. The two Sabbath texts in the commandments, in the so-called 10 Commandments or the 10 words, the Exodus 21 is the one that most people know. You shall keep the Sabbath, for in 6 days God created the world and rested on the seventh. So it's built into the rhythm of creation. And some would argue, well, then that's the way we're made. We're made in the image of God, and we need this as well. But the Deuteronomy 5 one is more explicit. It says, because you were slaves in Egypt. So you're supposed to, on the Sabbath, not only are you resting, but your donkeys and your servants are resting, because you got to remember how you were treated as slaves in Egypt. So you kind of have this notion of Sabbath rest is more than that therapeutic version of going to the beach. It's also about justice for those who are being run down into nothing. And of course, that one just gets really complicated because of a society we've built that has things that are running. And then I think, Greg, you were getting at this earlier. We had lost sight of our purpose, and I love this quote. We've advanced from canoes to galleys to steamships to space shuttles, but nobody knows where we're going. So it does raise the question, what is life for? What does flourishing look like? I wish I could remember where I got this one from, but it takes time to be formed as Christians. And the phrase that is used is desynchronization. I think Steve mentioned this. There is a certain amount of time required to grow a crop. And even with science and hormones in animals and all of that, you can speed things up, but there's diminishing returns. There's, it's the gestation period of a baby. You really need 40 weeks in the womb. That's really, really the magic number. So what is the magic number for us to be formed? What does it take to be formed? And I can't remember, this is what I can't remember, if it was Maya Angelou or if it was, I'm pretty sure it was a woman, but when someone said to her, well, I'm a Christian, she said, already? Really, already? And I really like that answer, that it takes time, that we're in that process of being formed. Well,
Mike, that's interesting. If you take a focus on that, what are those things then in which you become fully Christian? And you think of one's faith early, whether it's a conversion or a baptism. What's one's faith like until you become a mature Christian?
Yeah, because, there are different views of conversion. There are different views, like throughout history, there's this kind of theory called punctiliar conversion where it happens at a moment in time. You're born again. And then there are others who say, no, it's a process. And you are becoming whatever you want to call it, becoming Christian, becoming saved, whatever. And it's a process over time. And even if punctiliar were true, and you can't prove any one of them, but even if punctiliar were true, the critique of the punctiliar is, then I'm done. And the strength of the process is to say, not only were there many things that led me to this moment, whatever that moment is, but there will be many other moments of decision. Like today, we were looking at hymns for October 10th, a week from Sunday, and one of them was, I've decided to follow Jesus. And I tend to think of that as not a one-time thing, it's an ongoing kind of thing. So I think, discipleship is this kind of growing over time.
Well, and we're talking about losing sight of the purpose. I think, I don't know if I can say this right. In some sense, churches are some people in some churches that you would classify maybe as more enchantment, by their actions seem to me to have lost sight of their purpose. in,
What do you mean?
I mean, people who are condemning people all the time and judging people all the time for things, and they're not helping others. They're not doing the things Jesus said. They're more interested in punishing people, and if you don't believe like I do,
Right.
and to me, and I will admit that I could be wrong, but to me, they've lost sight of the purpose of Jesus coming, which was, I believe, to show us how to live in a human way.
Yeah, because that goes back to what's sometimes called personal piety and social piety. And the people who have an exclusive personal piety view don't really care about things in society. And then the people who have an exclusively social one don't care about how they live as long as they're just feeding the poor or whatever. And good tradition tries to hold these two together. It's hard to do. It's very hard to do. So in Ruth's book, this busyness of church life, I'm curious to see what you think about this. He calls it church-wide depression. And here's his summary of it. Sin in a secular age becomes an inability to optimize myself. And wanting church to be relevant, we insisted offer more programs. But we can't keep up with the programs because we got kids soccer this Saturday, but we do want you to have this to offer. And then because they can't keep up, they experience guilt, and then it's this kind of thing. And he calls this the fatigue of being the church. And here's the punchline. He, Taylor, everybody, they said, there's no way to undo this. There's no way to slow things down. They don't use this language, but that ship has sailed. It's a spaceship, and it's not coming back. You can't slow down society. It's only going to go faster.
Did COVID slow it down a bit?
It did. It did. And now, of course, we're picking it back
I
up.
got something every day this week.
Yeah.
And this.
I mean, because they showed that what the ozone layer even was doing during COVID, but now it's already coming back. Yeah. So I guess it's possible if we have an electronic failure around the whole world or something. I don't know what that would look like. I mean, we didn't have an electronic failure. We just had something upended us. But, and I mean, how many people, like at the very beginning when you were still just only going on walks, and even when you'd walk past somebody, they kind of go around. There were so many people out walking, and there was this kind of friendly spirit, like it was almost like we'd gone back into grandma's time, and we were going to have lemonade in the parlor, and play gin rummy on Sundays or something. And I guess it'd be Saturdays, you couldn't play cards.
Yeah, I was gonna say.
We're going to go back to the good old days, and we just sort of left that behind.
So the question is to your friend who says we're never going back to church. How can we have this busy church thing going on, but never go back to church? What are we replacing church with some other busyness?
Well,
What's going on there?
yeah, I don't know what's going on for her in particular, but for Ruth, and I'm not sure I agree, although I've certainly experienced it. I mean, I've heard people say, it's great that you have all those things, and then say, well, we'd like to have you come. Oh, yeah, we can't do that. So, I mean, that's real. I don't know, though, if his cycle of we want the church to have more, but we're not going to be able to do it. I don't know how accurate that is systemically. I'm still trying to process what I consider a very religious person saying, I'm no longer, I mean, she's going to be a religious person. She's not going to be an ecclesial person. She's not going to be a church-based oriented Christian. That's not the way she's going to be Christian. And I mean, as a person who's in this line of work, that's a little alarming, right? Because, how many churches are going to close out of COVID? How many are going to be greatly diminished in terms of people? What do you
I
think?
guess it goes back to what do you think the purpose of church is?
Yeah, exactly.
And if it's just to feed yourself and your own spiritual whatever, then you don't much need it. But there's more going on. I noticed that Village Presbyterian, they're doing a review of I don't know Presbyterian, I can't speak it, but there's evidently 4 or 5 tenants involved in it, and they're reviewing those right now in their sermon series about what the purpose
Mm.
is of church. And, yeah, I don't know.
Mm.
Because I have people in my life too who have no intention of going back to church, so.
Right. Yeah.
Well,
Well, and there are a lot of church people whose adult kids aren't going to go to church. Two of my three.
Well, part of it is that not every program is for every person.
Sure.
So saying a church should have more programs doesn't mean that every person has to do all the programs.
Right. True.
But your friend who says she's not going back to church, she has a community of Christianity. In the college where she teaches, it's a religious college, and what she teaches. Maybe
Yeah.
for her, it's not the same, and
Well, and they may have an intimate circle of friends too.
but anyway,
Yeah, it's a different day. And Ruth and Taylor, they were all writing pre-COVID. So I'm only beginning to see people start to write post-COVID. Okay, so here's a question for you. If you were summarizing this session for somebody that wasn't here, what would you say? How would you describe what we talked about?
I think it's very puzzling in the sense when you go back to the question that you had about a disenchanted society. And so I think that with an overabundance of information, I think we get into where we have to kind of shorten everything. So with the disenchanted, and you don't have the enchantment going on, you say things like, let's trust the science. Trust the science. So that's a very abbreviated form, trust the science. Well, if you talk to or look at many science subjects, they become very enchanting, and the scientists are very enchanted. Or, like you pointed out, critical thinking becomes, if you read anything about critical thinking now, it's anything but critical thinking. So the things become the opposite of what they say, and I think that's very dangerous. So now we're not just dealing with propaganda or marketing. We're actually dealing with, I believe, this is just my own theory, that we're dealing with lies. And then we go back to the very question that you had from the very beginning, and we just touched on it. Okay, so now what are we doing with this kind of?
Yeah, the problem.
How do you address that?
The thing you said about science reminded me, Postman has this thing, he said he did this on his colleagues. He would occasionally.
Who is it, I'm sorry?
Neil Postman. So he was a professor, and he would go in, these are very smart people, and he would say to his colleagues in the morning while they're having coffee, he said, did you see that study out of the University of Indiana? It's crazy that people who want to lose weight need to eat one slice of blackberry pie a day. And somehow, they don't even understand how it works. These people are losing weight. So there was a study out of the University of Indiana. And they would go, really? And he said because it was a study, because there was science, he was in essence saying science is now the new God. That the priest who would say, well, God says, now the science was, and he said he could put the craziest ones out, and these very intellectual people go, wow, I never heard that. That's interesting.
were these real studies, or was he just making?
Now he's making them up.
Making them up.
But he always said, I think it was Indiana, and there was one other, it was like he found those two schools, if you mentioned them, it was the best ones, got the best results or something. People were like, huh, that's interesting.
The word that popped into my brain after all of this is just one word. It was priorities.
Priorities?
No matter how much things speed up, no matter how much information is out there, no matter what you're looking into, if you have priorities, then you can put a lot of that by the wayside. So it really, it's only when you try and keep up with everything and don't prioritize what's important that
Right.
it gets to be too much.
Yeah.
Keep looking forward. We can't lament the past, can't put the genie back in the bottle. That's a fight that you're tilting at windows. You're not gonna win there.
Yeah.
Keep your eye on the prize, keep moving forward, put your faith in the word.
Okay.
Don't you think past generations have all this same conversation about changing times? Every generation has had some conversation about.
Yeah.
changing times.
Yeah, there's even quotes from the Roman Empire of how things are
Yeah.
going too fast.
Yeah,
The problem with that theory is they say that, I notice I said they, I'm not saying I necessarily believe it, that we've entered into a different thing. But obviously you can only go so fast, I guess, but what they're saying is not just that the pace, yeah, there's always been people who said, oh my gosh, a train going that fast, that's going to kill somebody or whatever. Not just that, but that, remember, we're plugging this into the disenchantment part too. So the difference, they may have complained about the pace of life in the village, but they still had an enchanted worldview. And what Root and others are doing is saying, well, here's an outcome of this disenchanted worldview, or, cause and effect, egg and chicken kind of thing. But this is a different result than our ancestors would have known. That it's not just that it's fast without the God equation. The spiritual grounding thing no longer is going to be the same.
Except that in both the enchantment and the disenchantment, there were bad things in the name of religion and bad things not in the name of religion.
Sure.
So you can't say, oh, the enchantment world, that was great. We all followed God. They didn't follow God.
Right.
I mean, a lot of people did, a lot of people didn't, but it wasn't a homogeneous kind of thing.
Yeah. That's why some people use the term post-Christendom, not the end of Christianity, but the end of this. So it goes back to Constantine, the emperor of Rome in the 4th century, who forces his troops to convert to Christianity, and not under him, but 50 years or 60 years later, the emperor makes it the official religion of the Roman Empire. And so state and religion become married, and that people have called Christendom. And this, by the way, is what secular too people will lament. They'll say, we used to say the Pledge of Allegiance, we used to say this, and we used to have the Lord's Prayer in schools, and all of these things. And that was when we had this thing called Christendom. If you moved to town, you went to this church, and whatever. And now that's not the thing. And some people lament that, and others go, well, maybe it was never meant to be like that, where everybody had to and was forced to, and it was wrapped up in patriotism and so forth. And so there's no question we live in a post-Christendom society, a disenchanted society. Well, thank you so much for being here. Next week, I'm going to try my best to do what I don't think they did a very good job of, and that is to try and suggest some strategies, of which we've already had some brainstorming. So thanks again. Appreciate it.